many doctors, I know many doctors have had paranormal experiences, but most of them just don't want to talk about it because they're doing a very left-brain job, and they don't want people to think that they're mad,
Welcome to a Broaderlands podcast. The opinions expressed on Broaderlands podcast are those of the guest speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the host or Broaderlands podcast. Dr. Blackwell, welcome to Broaderlands podcast. What an honor to have you on.
Oh, that's lovely. No need to call me Dr. Blackwell. You can call me Anona now. But just it's lovely to see you. You look like a deep sea diver with your headphones on. So,
yeah, thank you.
What I look like.
I'm excited to learn from you and listen to you. And I try to provide a platform so people could speak their experiences and their truth. And I really appreciate you coming on.
Cool. Thank you very much for inviting me.
You talk about touching the testicles of Archangel Michael. I'd love for you to expand on that. Joking around, but it's a joke. It's a joke.
No, I don't know if he's got testicles, but I think I chose him as a spirit guide because he always seems to be a rather handsome young man with a sword, But I didn't actually, in the book, it's on the Jeff Morrow podcast, wasn't it? When Archangel Michael asked me to examine my Jack Russell at 2:00 in the morning. Yeah, and I was arguing with him. This is a long story, but I had a Jack Russell called Keston and loved him to bits. And one night at 2:00 in the morning, I was awoken, and I know it was Archangel Michael, but it was a vibration at the time. I was kind of doing my spiritual healing training, and that was the Archangel I kind of prayed to. And it was a ridiculous thing, 2:00 in the morning. You've got to examine Keston's testicles, you see. And I thought, no, I've been working all day examining men's bits. Why should I have to examine the dog at the night, And I said, okay, look, Michael, I'm really tired. Go away. I'll examine them in the morning. And he said, you'll forget. And I said, no, I won't. And he said, yes, you will. You'll forget. And he was probably right. I would have forgotten. And he said, I'm not going away until you examine his testicles. So I go, all right. And this is like dark, 2:00 in the morning. I put my hand down. The dog on that occasion was sleeping by the side of my bed. And he loved having his tummy tickled. So as soon as I touched him, he rolled over on his back. Now, I probably examined thousands and thousands of testicles in my time, but not those many dogs' testicles. And so I was kind of groping around in the dark. And I said, Michael, there's nothing there. They're normal. And then he said, no, they're not. You've got to examine them again. And this went on for about 3 times. And then eventually I felt a subtle energy change in one of the testes. So I got the dog onto the bed, put the light on, and examined him properly. And I thought Michael was right, you see. So I said, okay, Mike, you can go now. I'll take the dog to the vet the following day. So when I took the dog to the vet, I had to lie. And I said, I was washing the dog. I couldn't exactly say I got woken up by an angel in the middle of the night because I was still a practicing doctor. And so I lied, and I said something that, and he examined him very carefully, couldn't find anything. And I know he couldn't find anything because it was in the dog's energetic field. It hadn't manifested, but I knew it was there. So the vet said, keep an eye on it. Keep an eye on the thing that wasn't there and come back if it appears, as it were, And then I waited until the energy had manifested, and you could feel a little lump about the size of, marrows, the seeds of marrows, about that side, sunflower seed side. I took him back to the vet, and the vet was same vet. He was so apologetic, and the dog had his testicle removed the next day. It was a malignant tumor, but it was one of the better ones that doesn't metastasize. So the dog was okay, and I did come clean because the vet was so contrite, that he'd missed this lump. And I said, I had, a good connection with Archangel Michael. He told me it was there before you could physically feel it. But I think when I had the Jeff Morrow comment, I said, I think I mentioned Archangel Michael, or not examining Archangel Michael's testicles. Cause I don't actually know if he's had them. I've never groped him.
Yeah, I thought that was funny. Yeah, so I appreciate it. What does it feel like to encounter or experience the presence of an archangel?
Well, it's very strange. It's like when I met King Charles years ago, I said I was a bit in awe of him, but after a while you realise they're human beings, and it's the same with angels. I was like, the first time I was aware of his presence, it just feels it's hard to say. It's like, how does a rose smell? It's just an awareness, and I only really tuned into him when I had a paranormal experience basically. When I was, I think it was about 2004, 2005, one of my colleagues at work, one of the nurses, died, but but I dreamt that he died the night before he actually died, and went into work early because I knew I'd need to support the staff. And then after a few hours, they said this poor chap had cycled home from work and died in his sleep. And that was like the second time I'd had a precognitive dream about someone's death. And it upset me because I didn't want to know somebody was going to die if I couldn't do anything about it. So I went to see a lady who was a spiritualist minister, and she told me that it was that if I didn't train as a spiritual healer, then they would keep pushing me until I went on a more spiritual path. So I thought, okay, because I'm interested in human consciousness anyway. So I did this 2-year course, and as I was, it was only like 3 hours a week for 2 years, but the more I kind of tuned into healing energies, the more I called in on angelic energy, and more paranormal things would happen. And so, yeah, you get used to it. It's like, how do I recognize you? I recognize you, okay, visually, but I'm sure if we were in the room, I would feel your vibration as well, because I was listening about your the Sandra Champlain interview, and I thought, God, this guy's awesome, because my upbringing was poor, but yours was like, how on earth did you cope? And I think it's tremendous credit to you that you're not dead, to be honest, considering the awful environment you had to cope with. You must be amazing.
No, thank you. Yeah, she's a really nice friend. Were you on her channel before?
Yeah, she was lovely. It was an hour and a half, and we got on really well. So I don't know it'll come up. It's like two kids at a tea party asking each other different questions, But she's lovely. She's charming. But I must admit, I was quite tired at the end of it, but no, she's great.
I mean, wave at her in case she's listening.
Yeah, I'll wave. Hi, Sandra. I think she's still editing it, actually. There was such a lot of stuff in it. It'll probably be 3 years later.
Yeah. You got from a scientifically trained physician to a mystic. What kind of doctor were you before? And how do you define what it means to be a mystic?
Yeah, well, what kind of doctor? Well, even how I became a doctor was like a spiritual thing. And it depends on how far back you want to go, because what happened, I was brought up in pretty much extreme poverty. We lived in a tin shed, and we had sacks on the floor and coats on the bed. Jack and I had a dog actually would be in bed with me to keep me warm because the hot water bottles would freeze, And my father was a bus driver. My mother had worked on a market stall, but they were both very bright. And my mother used to say, education is the salvation of the working classes. And since I was plump, and my mother would say to me, no man will ever want you because you're so fat. I thought, oh, well, I better. No, but I always was quite a nerdy individual doing little experiments. I used to breed rabbits and see what colour the fur was of the offspring, But anyway, what happened, I did a degree in London in biophysics, and it was quite a high-powered degree. And what happened is that just before I was doing finals, I had impacted wisdom teeth. And for my 21st birthday, my parents paid for me to have them removed privately. And in the hospital, I was given pethidine because they'd actually fractured my jaw as well. And I thought, isn't it amazing? How to taking someone's pain away is a wonderful thing to do. Now, I've already got a PhD organised in a disease called retinitis pigmentosa, and I was going to be coming to America. But I thought, yeah, that's academic stuff. Actually helping people is much cooler, And then I was doing a cleaning job in a local hospital just down the road from me in order to get some money. And I saw a lady in outpatients crying her eyes out, and she said she'd just been told that she had pelvic infection, which I suspect retrospectively was chlamydia, and that she'd been told she'd never have kids. And I can remember thinking, oh God, I'm only a cleaner. If I was a doctor, I could help her anxiety. And so that kind of turned me into becoming a doctor. And then, so I did a degree, as I said, in biophysics, and then I decided I wanted to do medicine. My parents thought, oh my God, how could they afford to get me through med school? But we managed. And then I was very interested in bacteria. I love bacteria. They're beautiful to look at, and they're more fun to kill, No, I'm just joking, but but you can actually see the little buggers on the microscope. Gonorrhea, you taught me about bacteria. I'll keep you here all night. It's so beautiful to look at. It's very symmetrical. Syphilis looks beautiful. And so I had a passion for bacteria. I didn't like viruses. So when HIV came along, I thought, tougher. So I ended up, got a job in a venereal disease clinic, and I was looking at all these beautiful bacteria. And then I got fascinated by doing research into vaginal infections. And as a result, very soon I was an international expert, because I think I didn't have a boyfriend, so all my energies were focused into doing research, you see, and looking at bacteria, God knows how many hours. And then because I was doing that, I was on my own a lot, because I'd spend my weekends just reading research papers. And I think being on your own, you cut off from material world. And that's when I started getting quite a lot of paranormal experiences. Although the first significant one was when I was about 17, I was in school, and I had it was on a Monday. I wanted to go to school, but I said to my mum, look, I've dreamt that Mr. Sharp, our deputy head teacher, was... No, I didn't know his name then, that's right. I just said someone at school is going to die. And I was terrified, didn't want to go to school. Same thing happened the next day. The third day, I said, oh, Mr. Sharp has died. And that was when I felt calm. So I said, Mum, I feel calm. Mr. Sharp had died. And she said, how could you possibly know? Because he was fit. But then I went to school, sure enough, this poor bloke had died again in his sleep. And so that was the first time I'd had a precognitive dream. But then whilst I was at St. Thomas's as a registrar, I just found I had a number of paranormal experiences, which I've described in the book. Some of them are quite funny, and I can go into those if you want me to. But as you've probably gathered, I talk too much, so I'll shut up now.
No, I'd love for you to go into those. But before we continue, you said gonorrhea inspired you to become a doctor.
No, gonorrhea didn't. No, you're getting it wrong. No. It was the fact that that this patient, this lady who'd just come out of gynae outpatients, was so distressed, and I thought, oh gosh, wouldn't it be nice to be able to help her, And also when I had my wisdom teeth, I thought, because the pain was awful, and then you go from being in pain to normality, and so I thought it's really cool, It made me feel good, so it's not really altruistic. You just feel good, and it was lovely. I used to love certain parts of my work were challenging, but it was lovely. If somebody got better, they'd hug you, It's probably against the law now, but there you go.
You've had a near-death experience, a severe allergic reaction. I'd love for you to describe that and explain what happened, and how did that change your perspective, your worldview on life and death?
Well, it wasn't a full near-death experience. Basically, this is telling you too much, but I was brought up teetotal, and so because we couldn't afford alcohol, and this one time I was doing my junior jobs, one of my colleagues had left, and they had a leaving party, and I can remember I had 2 glasses of red wine, that was all. But because my body wasn't used to it, the following day when I was on duty, I just didn't feel well, and one of my colleagues said, he'd give me an injection, anti-nausea. I said, all right, But then I had to go into the operating theatre with my boss, and I suddenly had what they call an ocular gyrate crisis, a bit of a mouthful, but I'd had an allergic reaction to this medication they'd given me, and my head was going back, and I became unconscious. And then all I can remember is blackness. I didn't have a tunnel, I didn't meet relatives, but it was a benign voice in my head. I was like floating, and it was dark, and I wasn't scared. And it said, if you want to, you can die now. And I thought, this is cool. I'd rather be where I am because life was really hard working 120 hours a week, But then they said, obviously if I died, I said, my mum, who just lost my dad, it would just crucify her. And I thought, I can't let her suffer. But then he said, okay, you can go back, but your life will be very hard. And so I came back, and that kind of was it. But it didn't alter my views. I think Wales, Wales has an awful lot of spiritual heritage, possibly because our resident witches were not killed off when those in England were being burnt at the stake. And even apparently there were only 3 or 4 in Wales, possibly because the women who were the so-called white witches, the ones who would be midwives and help people, were highly respected in their little communities. And so when the witch hunters came along, they were told to leave. But also, the witch hunters didn't speak Welsh. And so they couldn't understand the language. So I think we have more of a genetic heritage of maybe, I don't know, of the kind of link with spirit, shall we say. And we have spiritualist churches and spiritualist meetings all over the place. In fact, I chair one in Hereford nearby for a friend of mine twice a month, which is great fun because they let me tell a joke first, and they're usually quite naughty, but then we have a proper spiritual meeting, and then we meet up with mediums, and that's quite nice. I can't remember what your question was now. Sorry, can you repeat it?
How did it change your perspective that your near-death experience on life and death?
No, I don't think it did, because I was brought up on the land. My father was a dowser. He was also a bit telepathic. And as a child, there were no other school friends around because we lived quite a little way outside. And my father used to keep bees. And as a 6-year-old, if my mother wanted to find me, I'd be sitting next to a larch tree, next to a beehive. I never got stung. And I used to talk to the bees. I can't remember what they said, but I did have a spirit child called Christine, whom I can still remember. She had dark hair, quite neatly cropped. And I used to play with her in our cow barn. And so my mother accepted it. And I used to always insist my mother set a place at the table for Christine. But I wouldn't let her feed her. I think probably my love of food. I'm not going to share it with this girl, But there you go. So it was in me. It was in my genes. And so it didn't really spook me at all. It didn't really alter my feelings. Except when I was at St. Stephen's, I think it was only one paranormal experience. Was when my dad came into my room. I'd been working 56 hours non-stop, and I flopped on the bed. Suddenly he appeared in my bedroom and just said, "Phone your mum." That's all he said, and then disappeared into the wall. And then a few minutes later, the phone went to say that he just died. So yeah, it didn't alter. I was always a bit quirky, even though I had a science degree,
Wow. Can you rewind that? What exactly happened? Your father appeared to you?
Yeah. I was doing my junior house jobs in St. Stephen's in London, and the hours we worked were awful. 120 hours. 80 hours was our basic. But it was usually because we were on call every other night, and that didn't mean sleeping. It meant being, awake every other night. And so we were exhausted. And this one time, I'd been on duty such a long time, and I just flopped on the bed. And just my father, he just appeared. I knew it was him. And I'm trying to remember whether he appeared solid or not. I can't remember, but I knew it was my dad, and he just said, "Phone your mother." And then he'd actually died in the field, and one of his mates who was with him phoned me up to say, "You better come down, your dad's just died." So, yeah.
Interesting, yeah. You brought up witches and the witch wound. I don't know if you ever heard the term witch wound. Do you think we could bring in ancestral trauma from our ancestors?
I think it's possible, yeah. I think it's possible. Do I have any personal experience of it? Not much. I've described some of it in the book. But I had... years ago, I went to a little town called Caldicot, near where I lived in Swansea. And there was an antique shop there. And I saw this tiny little... It's called it's a Roman bronze little tiny willy, okay? In America, you do call penises willies, do you? I just...
Yeah.
But they're called, I think they're called fascinuses Yeah, tiny. It was a tiny one. No, I shan't make any comments. I know that is more. That's another story. But anyway, but it was only tiny. It's about an inch high, and it's kind of happy, shall we say? But it's bronze. And apparently, as I bought this little Willie, and it apparently Roman prostitutes used to wear them to show what they. But also, children were to ward off evil spirits. And so anyway, I took this fascinus along to a workshop I was doing with quite a famous medium. And she held it and she said, "Oh, this was yours in a past life, and you were a prostitute and you died in the gutter somewhere in Rome." I thought, "Oh, that's fine." Because if you believe in past lives, probably most of us, even you, have probably been a prostitute sometime. I don't know. It's a popular occupation, But anyway, so I thought that was interesting. And then years later, when I was doing my junior house jobs, I was a senior house officer. It's a very junior post, and a lady came to see me who was a high class prostitute, and I just knew everything she got up to, which, considering I'd been brought up incredibly innocent. My father wouldn't even wash his feet in front of us. It was very Welsh Wesleyan, and so sex was not something you discussed. And yet I seem to know. Now, whether that was, and the lady herself couldn't believe that I hadn't been on the job, because I just had this awareness. So whether it's carried in my DNA, I have no idea. But I don't know. I suspect past lives. Again, I've discussed it in the book. There's a chap called Doctor, I can't remember his name now, but he actually, is it Ian somebody or other? He's written a book called Old Souls, and he describes many instances where apparently in the Lebanon, it is the religious practice such they do believe in reincarnation. And in this particular book, they describe how one lady died when she was in her early 30s. And then years later, a child was born who believed when she grew up that she was this woman. And in the book, it shows you pictures of the two women roughly the same age. And this little girl said to her family, I used to be so-and-so, I'm married to so-and-so. And she was able to take, when the parents agreed, 100 miles away to where she lived in a past life. And apparently was able to identify members of the family, even a phone number she got right.
Wow.
And so, again, I find it absolutely fascinating. So, I think we do have past lives.
I do too. Ever since I was a kid, I remember having memories of I've been there, or inner knowing better. I've been there. I know that environment. That's it's too familiar, And when I had my awakening, I went back to some of those teachings from that environment, which I find interesting. But I always felt even future stuff. What's your take on reincarnation, past lives, parallel lives? What's the whole purpose?
Oh, God knows. I think there are parallel universes, probably all going on at once. But do I have proof of it? Personal experience. I'm not sure if I did put it in the book, but about 2.5 years ago, my dog, Fido, died suddenly, and I was heartbroken. If I could have committed suicide, I would have done. I had to have friends come and stay. But so I had to get another little dog to heal the hole in my heart. And prior to about a week before the little puppy was due to come, I got my gardener to dig up anything in my garden that could possibly be eaten by a puppy and cause it to die. So foxgloves, that sort of thing. And so I went out to talk to my gardener to tell him what plants to dig up. And he looked shocked. And he said, "You just came here moments before and then disappeared and then came back again." And I thought, that's weird, because he'd seen me come around the corner of the conservatory, walk halfway across the lawn, then disappear, and then come back to the corner and walk over again. And he said, "Have you been here twice?" I said, No. So I looked then on my CCTV, and what was interesting is that the first 3 or 4 times we played it back on my CCTV, all you see is me going across the lawn once. But on the 5th time we looked, I go across the lawn, disappear, and then come on again. So it's very odd. It's almost as though we live in a matrix.
Wow.
But that's my only personal experience of the suggestion that there's a heck of a lot more going on in our reality than we know.
Wow. I just recorded last week with Sophia Stewart, and she's the one that wrote The Matrix, the script in
Oh,
1982.
right. Gosh.
And during the interview, she was telling me about George Lucas, who wrote Star Wars. And she talked about an accident, and he may have experienced a walk-in. And
Right.
I guess my question to you is, because we were talking about this, I asked you if about entity attachments with addiction, or just believing if people can have entity attachments. And then you talked about a walk-in. I'd love for you to talk on that if you don't mind.
Oh, that was my mum. Yeah. Well, yeah, my mother was very bright. She was brought up, she was born in 1920, so she lived through some pretty rough times in the Welsh Valleys because grandfather was a miner. And so she was a woman of her generation, I suppose, very, very hardworking and extremely bright, but she couldn't progress because there just wasn't the money in the family. And so there was a degree of frustration in her head, I think, about not being able to fulfill herself, as it were. But having said that, she was a good mother until in 1975, my father died suddenly, and my mother blamed herself because what had happened, they'd been planting cauliflowers and all things all day, and she'd gone in to let the dog out, and my mother let the dog out and then went on making a cup of tea. And when she came out, my father screamed, "Why did you let the dog out?" Because the dog was running and breaking up the cauliflowers. And he then dropped dead, and my mother felt she killed him because he died in front of her. And as a result, she became incredibly depressed because she adored my dad, because she was 53 and he was 64. And she ended up having electroconvulsive therapy. And she was a different person after that, because what happened is that she was so depressed she wasn't eating. And I can remember coming home to see her from, was I in med school then? Yes, I was, to see her. And her eyes were different. And talk about the eyes being the access to the soul. She just looked evil, it was really weird. Although physically she was my mother, if I didn't know, if she wasn't in our house, I would not recognize her in the street, because even her facial configuration was awful. And it was scary because she was completely not her. And then eventually she had electroconvulsive therapy, and it did bring her soul back because I recognized her again, and she gradually got better. But she became, very challenging in certain ways. And so she reckoned that she had a demon living in her that was called Eric. And this became worse as she grew older. And she had to live with me from the time she was 88 because she couldn't cope anymore. And she would sometimes threaten to kill me. And then the next day she'd say, "I'm so sorry. It wasn't me. I dreamt you'd done something bad and it was Eric," whatever. But anyway, she was convinced she had what I would call a walking, what she would just call a demon. But after she died on Christmas Eve 2019. I think my mother was determined to ruin every Christmas indefinitely. That was probably the demon as well. But a lady who was a medium, who didn't know anything about my mum, she said that my mother had fought this demon for years, and even on the last day she was still fighting. It was only when she gave in and said, "Okay, you win," that they both died, but they both turned into pure light and love, and then disappeared off into wherever people go to. So so I think my mother probably did have a walk-in, and she certainly that the negative side of her certainly made me suffer. As I said, she killed one of my dog, Keston, because I caught her feeding him raisins, which is toxic to dogs. She was giving him handfuls, and I caught her doing it. And I said, "Why are you doing that? You'll kill the dog." I was livid, and she said, "Oh, you love him too much. If I kill the dog, you'll love me more." It didn't work that way, but he did die from kidney failure a few days later. But how can you, she was probably in her 90s then, and she had a brain tumour, what can you do? I loved her, but I certainly didn't like her. And I threatened her, I said, if you ever feed my dog anything in future, I had another one. She never did, because she knew I would chuck her into people's homes, because there's no way, It's like, if you want a near-death experience, harm my dog.
No, it's interesting you bring that up, because when I had my awakening, my friend Carlo was with me, but I blacked out. I was a blackout drinker. It was happening all the time where I didn't even know what I was doing anymore. And he said he was with me when I had I call it a nirvana experience, where I hit rock bottom. But he was in in the living room, and I was in a bedroom, and he heard these sounds that scared him. And he talked about me. It sounded like it was some kind of exorcist stuff coming on. And it like I was fighting demons. But after that experience, I woke up a different person, where I no longer, like, I was in a different state of consciousness. And I was no longer that old person anymore. I was no longer that alcoholic anymore. Like, I knew from that moment on, I was no longer going to drink, use, or live the way I was living from that experience. And I've been a different man ever since. So I guess I think I was asking you before we started recording, do you believe that addicts or alcoholics could have entity attachments as well that feed off of them? And since they're on a lower vibration, usually they have trauma or some, form of hurt or pain. Yeah.
I think it's possible, and it would be, nobody ever looks at that, you see, whether, was it Konstantin Korotkov? He's got, he developed something called gas discharge visualization, whereby you can measure the human energy field. And he's done some very interesting work, and it would be lovely if this sort of thing was taken more seriously. Because I know, again, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I'm not an expert, but I certainly have a friend years ago who, one of her close friends, a bloke, was admitted to a psychiatric unit as a schizophrenic. But she went and rescued him, really, because she said what she felt is that some schizophrenics, just have abnormal filters whereby they don't filter information in the same way that normal people do. And that she felt that that this guy was actually a medium, and the voices he was hearing was actually a direct link to spirit world. And I don't know. I think one does doubt one's sanity. Did I ever doubt my sanity? I've always considered myself a bit mad, to be honest. But not in the psychotic sort of way. But even when I started seeing patients, late relatives and pets, I kind of accepted it, which sounds weird, doesn't it? But I just thought, there's a nice little dog here. Because I remember once this lady came to my clinic, and she just wanted to check up because she's got a new partner. And as I was talking to her, I was interviewing her, you check the spreadsheet to make, not the spreadsheet, the patient notes, make sure you got the right person. and I suddenly, I said, and she said, "Are you all right, doctor?" I said, "Yes." I said, "A little black dog has just jumped on my lap and it startled me." Well, considering it was an invisible dog, a normal patient would have screamed saying, "This doctor's absolutely mad, I'm not going to see it." But in fact, she said, "Oh yeah," she said, "That's Sooty. It's my late father's dog." She said, "He still follows her everywhere." So I just looked at his black curly hair, fur rather. and as soon as I acknowledged him, he disappeared, but I could feel his warmth on my lap, So, but I loved dogs.
Wow.
And another time a lady came in with a horse, so I am told you that, that was fascinating. I told that one to King Charles, and that was amusing, the interaction I had. But anyway, this one clinic, a lady came to see me. She had unexplained abdominal pain, and she'd seen a gynecologist, gastroenterologist, etc. And the gynecologist was a lady who used to come to my meditation group, and I think she suspected this lady's problem was more spiritual than physical, but she sent her along to me for a checkup for infection. And as a lady walked in, she was in her, I would imagine, late 30s and just dressed regularly, normal. And a horse followed her, and it was a lovely horse. It was brown and white and black, and it had a multicolored mane, the same color as this lady's hair. And I could see this horse, and it was muzzling the top of her head. And I thought, ignore it, but it got so, I thought, if I don't say something, the horse is going to poo in the room, And I looked at the patient and I thought, she doesn't live in the stables. I was trying to think of anything that could create this image in my head. And so in the end, I said to her, this is in the middle of taking a sexual history, so you can go from one thing, when did you last have sex, to and when was your last period? And by the way, did you ever own a horse? It's sort of a bit of a non sequitur, but my clinics are a bit like that. And anyway, I said, excuse me, I didn't say excuse me, I said, did you ever own a horse? And she said yes. And I said, was it brown and white and black? And did it have a multicoloured mane, the same colour? No, because she had tints in her head. And she said yes, but it wasn't brown, it was tan. No, I'm not horsey. Apparently they call it tan instead of brown. It was a light brown, So she said yes, and I said, oh, did it used to muzzle the top of your head, when it was greeting you? She said yes, it did. I said, oh, I said it's here now. I said, and I think it's come to give you love and strength, you see. But anyway, that was that. She didn't consider me nuts, and I carried out a pelvic examination, and like my colleagues, I couldn't really find anything what we call functional. I couldn't figure out anything that could be causing this pain. And anyway, as I was finishing talking to her, explaining blah, 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 she told me about a personal family matter. And as a result, her family had cut her off. They just didn't want to know her. And I said, how has that affected you? And she said, I am gutted. She said, I'm gutted. And then the penny dropped for her and for me. That it was the fact that she'd had this problem which had resulted in her own family ignoring her. And so she understood that she'd taken her pain and put it in her abdomen. And that day we happened to be assessed. Every year we'd have to have, it was supposed to be anonymous. Patients come in and they say whether they think you're any good or not. She'd signed her, so she said that she was grateful because I'd helped her understand what was really important in life. And the strength, the horse had given her strength. And the fact I think I'd seen the horse made her believe me when I said that I felt that it was an emotional issue she had, So that's cool.
Yeah, that's powerful. I know you've talked about experiencing what you call ripples in time. I'd love for you to broaden our lens on your experience and what that actually means. Is that proof that the body holds memory beyond the conscious mind?
Oh, yeah. Even I'm not sure what ripples in time mean, but it sounded good, didn't it?
Sounds awesome.
Yeah. Einstein believed that everything was in the now, the past, the present, and the future, as you probably know, are all as one. I find that hard to grasp. But I have had experiences where my consciousness has flipped forward. And I had a friend who was actually an internationally well-known medium called Angie Kruger. And she happened to be staying with me in Swansea, over 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And my guest room was immediately above the kitchen. It was a 2-story house. And one morning I was cooking. All she wanted was a boiled egg. It was their last day. And we'd been discussing the possibility of doing a workshop in my home a few months later. And 2 things happened then. Firstly, Michael came into the kitchen and he said, if you don't check her tyres, she'll have a blowout on the M4. And he told me where, and she'll die.
Wow.
Because there was a problem with her tyres. So anyway, when Angie came downstairs, I could hear her walking along the corridor. And I said, don't worry, it hasn't gone through to the mattress. She said, how do you know? I spilled coffee on the bed last night and it hasn't gone through to the mattress. And I said, I hadn't been peeking on her or anything. I just said, it was the truth. In my head, I'd gone forward about 4 hours in time when she'd left and I was changing the sheets. And so she said, yeah, because she was a medium. She knew what was going on. The only thing that was strange is that when I did change the sheets, the patch of coffee stain wasn't as big as I'd seen in this image. And that spooked me. Because I thought, oh God, there's more than one parallel universe coming on here. Another one where there's more coffee, But anyway, what was interesting then, I told her about, she had a split in her car tires and blah, blah. And it was raining. And I said, we got to go. You're not going to have your breakfast until we've checked your tires. She was quite stroppy, and so was I. And I said, look, you're not having your breakfast till we go and check. Because Archangel Michael has just told me blah, blah. And she said, no, there's no problem. I said, yes, there is. So anyway, I took her out. And sure enough, there was this slit in the side wall of her tire. And she looked rather contrite. And she said the reason she thought there was no problem is that her spirit guide, a chap called Richie, had told her there was a problem with her tyres, and she'd taken it to a tyre place and they hadn't found anything. But when it came to me, the way she parked her car, the weight, if you can imagine, it was the weight of where the wheel was, it had actually opened up the slit so you could see it better. So, yeah, I don't know if that explains ripples in time, but but I think sometimes we do kind of go fast forward and then back into current reality.
Well, and I find that fascinating because you also mentioned future memories, the idea that consciousness can flip forward in time. I'd love for you to touch on that because that kind of reminds me of something when I was a kid. Do you have any experiences or examples you can share with that?
Well, not really. I think most of that was, do you know PMH Atwater? She'd written a book on future memories. Yeah. And so really, I wouldn't consider myself an expert. All I can say is that from the time I was a child, I knew I would write books or a book. From the time I was very young, and considering we couldn't even afford to have them in the house, But when my editor came to stay with me, 4 years ago initially, I managed to find a book I'd actually written when I was 13, and it was 42,000 words, and quite funny. It was like, I was just a young teenager talking about life, but it was quite mature. And so, yes, I think I always knew I would write. I didn't really know I was going to be a doctor, but but I can't really comment because I haven't got that much experience on future memories. Have you got any?
It's helping me think when I was a kid. I knew I lived in certain lives in the future, what we would call the future. I had this inner knowing, but I never had the right lingo to explain that. I wonder if that's a future memory that I had a life in the now, in the future now.
What were you doing? What were you doing in your future life?
Well, being so fascinated with Star Wars and Star Trek, I remember living in an environment like that, a different reality, which we would label as the future. Could that be a future memory? I guess that's what I'm trying to look at within myself and my own experience. Like I've been there before. I know that. That's so familiar. It's, it's just like this inner knowing. So, I don't know.
I'd love this to be my last incarnation because the world is getting to such a state, isn't it? But maybe we'll be incarnated on a different planet, or I don't know. It's just very sad because as an individual, because with my book, I had to write it because I knew it was in my destiny. And do you know what's interesting? I had a numerology reading. Again, I've written about that in my book. And this lady was amazing. All I gave her was my name and date and time of birth. And she came back with, it took her a little while, but it was like an hour and a half. And it was, she said, I got a transcript as well. And she said that I was either an academic doctor or a writer, but she said writing is right the way for, and that's something from the time I could write, and I was a late reader. I couldn't read or write until I was 8. In fact, they were a bit worried in case I was a bit mental health issues. But no, I just suddenly started reading and writing when I was 8. But after that, wouldn't stop me, and I was always writing little essays. And then I wrote my first book when I was 13. And considering the poverty we were living in, it was a very weird thing for me to do. But I didn't like going to parties. I didn't even know who the Beatles were. Probably a benefit, but I don't know. I think Paul's really cool. Who's your favourite?
That's awesome. How would you define being a mystic in today's world? Speaking of a chaotic world.
Yeah. Oh, I'm a great follower of Caroline Myss. You know Caroline Myss? She's an American guru. And in fact, I go to so many of her workshops, but the last one was in February of this year. And we've got the same sense of humour, and I love teasing her. But she's got various views on what a mystic is. But I would think it was someone who is aware that physical reality is not all there is. And then it can that understanding can manifest in many ways. With me, I just love being out in the garden. Today I've been clearing up my pond and planting, repotting some sweet corn, that sort of thing. And I'm on my own, but you can just meditate and think. And then if people come to my home, usually I attract people that need something, and just looking at the mountains and sitting in the garden, and the dogs messing around. So yeah, that's how I feel. That's how I define mysticism. But I don't believe in religion. It's probably an awful thing to say, but I think religion is used as a way to control humanity. I remember once going to a workshop, and I'm not sure, I think it was Richard Bandler, but I don't want him suing me, but I think it was him who said there should be as many religions as there are people. And I think we all need a direct connection to spirit, God, whoever you want to call it, Ishi or it. And that when you get man intervening, I don't want man in a frock telling me that I've got to, pray in a certain way, as it were. So I'm not much into religion. I think there's a lot of good done in the name of religion, but an awful lot of bad as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think we're kind of conditioned not to question religion, Mm-hmm. And I think there's a saying in Judaism where every generation should re-experience God for themselves. Yep. And I think, we get so caught up in the past of what someone's saying, what God is or what spirit is, or, what the truth should be, versus having your direct experience with, which is what mysticism is, or Gnosticism, and I think for me, it's like really someone that's centered in the heart, remembering who we really are, and connected to the all, from the dog to the next human being, and our interconnectedness amongst one another. We're not separate, and they don't live. And I think a mystic is someone that doesn't live in label consciousness, the us against them mentality. Yeah. Authenticity. Exactly. They find their authenticity.
Exactly. Yeah.
I love it.
I can remember my dad died June the 18th, 1975. This is something to lighten things a little. But I'd forgotten the date he died. But for weeks I had this constant thing in my head saying that I had to do a kind of vision quest under a tree. I've got a Euglens regia macrocarpa. It's a giant walnut tree. I planted it in 1975, so it's a huge tree now. And 30 years after Dad's death, I kept on saying, you've got to go and do a vigil, a kind of shamanic vigil. And so on this particular day, and then as I was coming near, I thought, oh gosh, that is the day Dad died. And so I set up an area around the tree. You put salt around to protect yourself, a big area. And I got it really comfortable. And I said to Spirit, whoever was talking to me, I said, look, one spot of rain and I'm in, because I didn't want to spend the whole night just meditating, because I had candles and everything. I was on my own. My mother was in the house. And anyway, so there was I. And I thought, I was trying to get connection with my father. And I was out there about 6 hours, and I was getting really bored and a bit cold. And suddenly there was one drop of rain on my head. Great. I thought, that is great. I did say if it rained, I would be going in. So anyway, so I go back in the house. This was actually 2 weeks after my aunt had died, whom I absolutely adored. And I was in my bedroom. And my mother, I think I woke her up actually when I came in, because it was about 2 or 3 in the morning. And I was lying in bed in the dark. And suddenly I could hear some weird activity, scratching on the pillow next to me. And I thought it was my late aunt. So I said, oh, Auntie Vi, you've come to visit, But it kept going on. And so I put the light on, and it was a mouse eating a peanut, And what had happened is that my mother had cleared out a pond the day before, and had left all the doors open. And this family of mice had moved in. So I quite like mice. It was cute little thing, but I didn't particularly want it, eating a peanut on the bed, on the pillow next to me. So I jump out of bed, go into my mother's room and say, there's a mouse in the house, you see. And she said, no, there isn't. And suddenly, she was in her 80s, another mouse went across the room and under her bed. I've never seen an 80-year-old move so fast. And we ended up in the conservatory, sleeping in the conservatory while our Jack Russell was mouse hunting. So I know that was a bit naughty, it's a bit off-piste. But yeah, I do try to be a mystic, but sometimes it doesn't always work out. You end up with a mouse.
I mean, I think we're still having a human experience, whether we've tapped into the mystic or not. And I think many of the mystics had their flaws, their own patterns and behaviors.
Oh gosh,
I think,
yes.
Yeah. I mean, you see a lot of the Christian mystics, they had a lot of addiction going on within themselves, or sex addictions and stuff like that. They had their own little behaviors.
I wouldn't mind having a bit of sex addiction. I don't have any chance. And I don't actually. It's awful. When I was younger, I couldn't afford alcohol. And I'm old. I don't particularly like it, And I think, what am I addicted to? Oh, I'm addicted to stroking my dog's tummy, but that's allowed. I promised the judge I'd stop doing it.
That's funny.
And I love making people laugh to an extent.
Yeah.
That's probably an addiction. Yeah.
Yeah. And me too. I get a little carried away at times. Do you believe being a physician yourself, do you believe other doctors or physicians have paranormal experiences more than not?
Yes.
And don't talk about it?
Yes. Oh, yeah. There's a lovely guy called Dr. Ian Rubinstein, Rubenstein, who wrote a book, actually, in about 2007. Now, he's semi-retired, but he's also a practicing medium. And so, curiously, back in 2007, I had contacted him and I'd forgotten about it. And recently, after my book was published in February, Psychic News did an article about the book. And Ian contacted me. And it was only after a while we realised we already had each other's email addresses. And he has had loads of paranormal experiences. The other thing is that there was another chapter in the book called Other People's Experiences that my editor felt would make the book too long. But yeah, I'd written about certainly many doctors. I know many doctors have had paranormal experiences, but most of them just don't want to talk about it because they're doing a very left-brain job, and they don't want people to think that they're mad. I got away with it because I had 3 Lancet papers. I was chairman of the Trust Consultants Committee. And in fact, when I met King Charles, Prince Charles as he was then, I was telling him a story about the lady who came into the clinic with the horse. And he said, Dr. Blackwell, don't your colleagues think you're rather mad? He's a lovely man. His voice, honestly, is gorgeous. And it was very Charlesy ways. And I said, well, sir, I was chairman of the Trust Consultants Committee, got 3 Lancet papers, I got a higher award, I'm on the Royal College of Physicians Integrated Health Committee, and something else I can't remember. And so I said, when I tell my colleagues a patient came in with the spirit of a dead horse, then they asked me what type of horse, which was true. I kind of got away with murder, I think. Not actual murder, I got away with being slightly eccentric. Yeah. And mainly I was a workaholic as well.
Mm. You talked about, you had a chapter of other people's experiences. What was that chapter about?
Other people's experiences.
Was that like...
It was lots. It was actually one of them. I had.
Oh, duh.
I'm teasing you now. I told you that. You have to edit the wicked bits out. Yeah, there was lots of them. One of them was my former colleague. She used to be my secretary, a lovely lady called Wendy. And she sent me a piece about when she was young, about she used to see this bloke come into her bedroom, and it turned out he was a nasty piece of work who used to live in the house, but it was quite a bit longer than that. And then there was a chap who was a surgeon, and he I got to be careful because I want to make sure I don't identify him, but he was a surgeon. Yeah. And when I first met him, I could see orbs around him, and so we ended up talking about spirituality, and he told me a story about how once he had a patient who was on end-of-life care, a young woman, and he didn't want to say to the family that that she was going to be passing on, but he could see spirits actually leave patients. And when he was he went to speak to the grandmother to say, look, I don't think she's got much longer, and the grandmother said, oh, it's okay. This particular young woman had come into her kitchen that evening and had a long silver thread attached to her, and had said to her grandmother that she hoped the thread was long enough, but that she would be leaving. So it was a lot of stuff, but but again, it was a case of Sandy, who's my editor. I always had great respect for her, but a little bit of fear, so I did listen. But there was a whole load of stuff, because what's quite interesting is that Winston Churchill was a mystic. And when I was researching the book, there were some crazy stories about during the war. He had a cabinet meeting apparently, and halfway through, he said he went into the kitchen and said to the staff, "Just give us sandwiches and go to the air raid shelter." And then about half an hour later, the kitchen was bombed and they would have all been killed. So he kind of knew. And this other story, which I think is really cool, is that he was staying in the White House, and he was in a bedroom that used to be Abraham Lincoln's office. And one night, Churchill was having a bath rather, and apparently he got out of the bath, so the story goes, stark naked, obviously, but with a cigar in his mouth. And he went into the bedroom, and he saw Abraham Lincoln leaning up against the mantelpiece, you see. And apparently he said to him, Mr. President, I believe you have me at a disadvantage. And then, that was cool. So he actually saw, so I think a lot of the world leaders have had experiences, but maybe not all of them admit to it, And Hitler was very much into the occult.
Wow.
So there you go.
I'm going to have to connect you with a good friend of mine. Her name's Sarah K. Grace, the psychic paramedic. And she could see all this happening, like you explained as well. Yeah, I think you guys would have a great conversation.
Yeah, fun. Yeah.
I think you talk about you once sensed a man's health issues telepathically during a dinner.
Oh, right. Yes, that was funny. Yeah. No. In fact, I can mention one of the names because you don't mind. Is a chap called Tobias Philin III. Now, he, I haven't seen him for, 40 odd years, but we kind of went out together for about a month, just when I can't remember if I was a medical student or a junior doctor, I can't remember. But we still keep in touch, and he's an interesting character. It was his office, I believe, that was blown up during 9/11, only he wasn't there at the time, luckily. But, he's very interesting. Now, what happened is that he took me to dinner to meet some friends. I think it was called the Sarrels, and it was in a very posh area of London. So we had a dinner party, and bearing in mind, I'd only been used to tin sheds with wooden, like a cabin really we lived in. And this was like a real house, and it was a very posh area, and there were like chandeliers and mahogany and God knows what. And anyway, I can remember that was the first time I'd ever had a card, and I didn't know what it was, excuse me, what is this we're eating, And they had sugar that was in big granules, and I thought it was glass sugar. But anyway, Toby was sitting opposite me. The lady of the house was on my left, and there was a bloke I'd never met on my right. And during the course of the meal, the chap on my right kept on and on. All he would talk about is the fact that he'd got a urethral infection, and that he was afraid the antibiotics wouldn't work, and his girlfriend would leave him if he told her that she had to go for a checkup, blah, blah, blah. So, and I was getting a bit bored, I thought this is too much like work. So when there was like a coffee break, I said to him, look, don't worry about your NSU. Keep taking the tablets and tell your girlfriend you were drunk. You'd probably get away with it, you see. And then he went absolutely pale and he said, how do you know? He said, I haven't said a word to you all evening. And what happened, he was so mentally thinking about this all the time. We were sitting next to each other. So I think our energetic fields had overlapped. And I think our brain merely processed information like a television set, And so this poor guy probably thinks that all Welsh women and witches. And, I wonder if he's still alive, actually. I probably scared him to death. So, yeah, that was cool.
And you had an amazing life. I love the stories. And I ordered your book, but it's not coming in until late tonight. It was delayed.
Right.
It was delayed for some reason through Amazon. And so I'd love to get you back on because you have all these stories. And I know you wrote an article for The Lancet predicting the future medical breakthroughs and a global pandemic.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, and I never
but
sent
you chose
it in.
Yeah.
It was, in fact, I'd forgotten I'd written it. And because I've been thinking about writing a book for years, I literally got, I had to do it like that sometimes, files that big. And a lot of the stuff I'd written about contemporaneously. And it's great because I could put dates, etc. And I even had letters from patients confirming what had happened, And I came across this article, and it was, I think it was 2007 in February. The Lancet had asked people to write in with an essay that would be published at the end of the year. And it could be, I think they wanted it on a history of medicine going ahead in time, So I based this article in 100 years from, so I can't remember, I'm not very good at sums, but 2107. Oh, no, you know what I mean. Anyway, 100 years from 2007. And when I found this article, I hadn't seen it for like 20 odd years. I'd actually predicted a pandemic. And I thought, oh my God, this is weird. And I talked an awful lot about this pandemic increasing the need for kind of electronic diagnostics. So that I thought that in this article I said that people would just put their hands on a machine, like Korotkov's gas discharge visualization, it would then be red. And then if there was a problem, it would, if it was a minor problem, it would go to a nurse consultant. Otherwise, if it was a medical problem or if it's a surgical problem, but if it was a spiritual problem, it would go to a shaman. And so, yeah, so a lot of it was kind of eerily true. Yeah. And it's booked me and my editor. So we published it, even though it didn't actually go into the Lancet. But then I did publish something else, which I did put in the book, called HRT is for women that go mad at the menopause. And for me, my paranormal mediumship abilities kind of increased at the menopause, and it makes you wonder, what they call it, maiden mother crone, isn't it? So I'm very much a crone. Only when my mother moved in, it was so hard because, I'd have to be 3 o'clock in the morning, she'd fall out of bed or whatever. And I lost almost all my mediumistic ability, which is sad. It's like living in a world where there's colour and suddenly have your mother switch the light off,
Oh, I thought, okay. Said you were going to continue.
No, so I did. We were both connecting at a spiritual level, which is cool. I love doing that. You kind of, I've got a friend in Norway who's lovely, and when she comes and stays, we don't actually say much to each other because you just tune into the other person's consciousness, and it takes you to a higher realm. So if you like, we can spend the rest of the interview. I'll just look into your eyes, darling, and the rest of your life will be an anticlimax, For my life, maybe I do.
I love you. You're awesome. You have a unique blend of medical insight and mystical experiences. And being a psychic, how do you envision the future for humanity? Do you see like anything unfolding both at a spiritual and a societal level?
I personally think, and there is a friend had an experience which I can't talk about because she doesn't particularly want it known. I think in the moment we are in a very long Armageddon, and I think there's good and evil are fighting, and I think in a way, I know it sounds really, really silly, but I almost feel if we had contact with aliens, then it would be quite interesting because it could go one way or the other. It could get people to realise that religion is just controlling the masses and it controls them through fear. If you don't do this or why you'll end up in hell, that sort of thing. And I think if we could, but people are so controlled by other people's thoughts. And the thing about living on my own, I just, the person who dominates me is my dog, and he's on the whole, and I was threatening with the vet if he misbehaves. So I think I think it could go either way. And I think that, in a way, I'm hoping that my book will open up people's minds, that you can have, God knows, you can have degrees and a lot of academic success in the left brain world, and yet also be aware that I think we're all very much responsible for our actions. It doesn't stop me getting cross. I still get cross, but I feel more guilty about it, probably. No. So how do I think it'll go? I think that spiritual awakening is, if we don't have that, I think that would be our salvation. But you see, I talk about in my book about Wetiko, this Native American term for the energy of greed, really. And when you look around the world, it's all greed. People want land, they want oil, they want resources. And it's like, yeah, I'm lucky. Having been poor, I now regard myself as being really wealthy, but and I think you can only sleep in one bed, and I prefer growing my own food and cooking it and sharing it with a dog. I can't understand the mentality that needs to own 101 yachts and flying off everywhere. But then it's probably a deficit in myself, because I remember my mother said to me, she taught me how to work, but not how to enjoy myself. And yeah, I don't know what makes me happy, really. I like it when the ducks don't eat my tadpoles, but they've eaten them all this year. So.
It's probably simplicity, to be honest. What makes you happy?
I think so. Well, I don't. Einstein said the pursuit of happiness is the ideal of swine, but I think we're so fortunate in the Western world. We don't have bombs dropping on us. Most of us don't, and we've got enough food on the table. Most of us, and yeah. But I just like seeing my garden peas come up and seeing my potatoes grow, and yeah, and my dog kind of. I wake up with him sleeping on my head, which is, oh, yeah, somebody loves me,
I mean, you talked about the fear of being mad, being labeled mad, considering by coming out with your experiences and talking about the paranormal and the medical field. What gave you the courage to come out of the closet?
Well, to be honest, I didn't fear it, but I know my colleagues do, because I am what I am, and. Yeah. The only time I felt bad about it was, there's loads of reasons for writing a book. But one of the profound things that I wanted it widely known, because I'm hoping this woman might still be alive and might read the book and realize I was writing about her. But in this one clinic, a lady, it was early on in my spiritual awakening, shall we say, and I was working in Singleton Hospital in Swansea. And a lady came into my clinic who just wanted a checkup. She was probably in her early 40s. And as she walked in, she sat down, and a little boy walked past her and disappeared into the wall. And I remember he had black curly hair, and he had a white T-shirt and dark shorts. And although I only had a side view of him, I could actually see his face as well. He was quite chubby, but a bit gangly, like a pre-pubertal kid would be. And he just walked and disappeared into the wall. And as I was interviewing this lady, I just thought, oh, that's interesting. Because I had similar things, but this was quite early on. And as I was interviewing her, she said that she'd had a child who'd died in a tragic accident. And she said, as her exact words, funnily enough, doctor, I've just been to see a medium, and she told me he follows me everywhere. And I didn't tell her that I'd seen him, and I should have done. And because the clinic was busy, and I was early on, and I thought, oh gosh, I don't want to upset the patient, etc. So anyway, that evening I felt very guilty that I hadn't said anything, and I tried to look up her case notes, but she hadn't given her contact details, and I've regretted it every day since, because I felt that spirit had sent her to me, because she didn't have any reason to see me. She hadn't been sexually active for ages, had no symptoms. And I realized later that if a patient came to see me for no apparent reason, it was usually a spiritual matter, not a sexually transmitted disease. But anyway, so I actually did this bargain with spirit. I said, okay, I'm feeling bad about this. There's nothing I can do to help this lady. But if you promise me that if I say what I see in future, then you'll protect me from any adverse consequences, because I didn't want to lose my job, or have somebody complain or upset anyone. And they never let me down. And then years later, a similar thing happened. It sounds really weird, but a lady came to see me. I thought she was old, but she was a lot younger than I am now. She was probably in her 60s. And she'd had 2 changes of buses to come and see me. She lived quite a way in the Welsh valleys. And I asked her what the problem was. And she said, "I honestly don't know, doctor." And I thought, that's very strange. No one's ever said that before. So I said, "Well, have you got any symptoms?" So I went through usual symptoms. And then I said, have you had a partner other than your husband recently? I was trying to be diplomatic. And she started laughing. She said, "Oh, no," she said, "I've been married since we were 19. It's like it was a big joke." And I said, "Well, what's brought you to an ED clinic then, And I said, "Do you suspect your husband's been unfaithful?" There's more laughter, because they were, quite religious, etc. In no way. And I said, "Well, have you any idea?" And I said, "Did you ask to see me personally?" She said, "No." She said, "I just phoned up the clinic and had the next available appointment." So she hadn't asked for me. And I was thinking, is this woman crazy? And I didn't want to put her through having tests on her bits when it wasn't necessary, because she didn't have any symptoms and no risk factors. And so suddenly she had an awakening. She said, "I know who you are." And I thought, "Oh, do you?" I don't know who I am. But anyway, she said, "You gave me a reading 2 years before." And what had happened is that 2 years previously, I'd gone to an open circle where there was a medium in a place called Havanacoy, which is a spiritual centre in the valleys. And apparently I'd given her a reading because the medium had said, if anybody got any things to say, and my friend who was with me outed me because I whispered to her, "I think that lady over there got a message for her." And I was embarrassed. I didn't want to say anything. But anyway, I said, "I think that lady over there." I said, "But it's really weird." I said, "Because what I've got is mother energy, and this mother energy died from breast cancer. But she's saying to this lady, don't let your mother drag you down, because her mother was apparently quite challenging. But it didn't make sense. I thought, how can a mother be dead? And yet the message is, don't let your mother, drain your energy." She burst into tears, came across the room and hugged me and said that it was her late aunt who died of breast cancer. And she said the last word she'd said to her aunt was, "You're more like a mother to me than my mother." And that was the lady that came to the clinic. When I saw her 2 years later, she had no idea. She didn't know who I was, etc. But her problem was spiritual. It wasn't physical. And in a way, it's almost as though her spirit guide and my spirit guide, her spirit guide, said, "Oh, anybody, do you know who this woman is?" And somehow I'd contrived to get her to come and see me. Wow. I have no idea. It's totally weird, but I don't know. These things happen and I couldn't explain them.
It's amazing. I'm going to ask you a couple more quick questions and then we'll end it.
Yeah, that's okay, dear. Fine. End it. Oh, dear. Bang. I don't trust you Americans. You've got a gun up your sleeve. There's another joke there, but I mustn't say it. Yeah. It's a Mae West joke, but anyway, no.
Well, it's funny, and I didn't know I wasn't an American until I moved to a certain part of the country. How do our loved ones and our pets try to communicate with us after death?
Yeah. Well, for me, it's via a lovely medium called Jane Hutchinson, who to me is the world's best medium. Yeah. Curiously, I've had 1 or 2 occasions where one of my dogs have visited, but not my family. And you'd expect to get messages from your loved ones, but the way I've got messages through has been by going to a really good medium, and I'm very selective, as you can imagine. But one of the nice stories is my friend Jane phoned me up one day, and she said, "I need to talk to you because Fido, that's my late dog, had a message for me about Jasper, my current Jack Russell. And she said Fido had told her that Jasper was going to try to escape from a certain part of my garden. And she said, you must go and check the fence. And she told me where. So I said, okay. So I go outside, check the fence, nothing. And then, because Jane's never wrong, I thought, right, that when it was daylight the following day, I went again, checked all around the perimeter, especially this place Jane had told me, and there was no problem. And then a day or so later, I was doing some weeding, and my Jack is such he's a little character, but I call him Jingle Bells because I put bells on his collar so I know where he is, you know. And suddenly I stopped hearing any jingle bells. So it's rather like a kid. When you don't hear them, you worry, you know. So I go and look for him. And he's in part of the garden where Jane said he would escape. And he'd bitten through some rusty chicken wire and had his head, you know, through this hole. So I thought, oh gosh, Jane was right. So I made a quick repair and then went to get some proper weld mesh that he couldn't get through. By the time I come back, he'd got a bigger hole. And he'd put his head right through, and it's part of his body. The only thing that stopped him, he's got his willy caught in one of the little rings in the chicken wire. And so I had to do a kind of breech delivery and then put the weld mesh on. So, yeah, I think our pets do kind of take care of us. And, yeah, communication is like really cool, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And, you know, finding a good medium is just so healing. I know for me, it has been on my own journey. And, you know, a lot of times we talked about religion earlier. Religion will say that's devilish. Don't do that.
No,
and,
it's not. No.
You know, and I remember being in a convention one time. It was about 300 and some, maybe more people. And I'm sitting, I found a medium, and the ones I wanted to go to were packed. You know, they were too busy. And then I walked by this couple, and something told me to stop and talk to this lady. I sat down with her, and I had a reading, and my father popped up, and my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law was shot in the head a few weeks after my dad passed away, who fell off a cliff.
I saw that in Sandra Champlain. Yeah, you had a really tough upbringing, didn't you? But Jane is amazing. If you PM me, she does online stuff, and she's not expensive because she does it for her heart, you know. But there's a really cool story about loved ones, which I think would be a nice way to end if you're looking for a suitable end. And this was years ago. Again, I've written about it. Lady comes in, she'd been drug raped, and what had happened is that she was married in her late 40s, young teenage kids, and she never went out because she was very family orientated. But her best friend had a hen party, and during the hen party, her drink was spiked, and she'd woken up in a hotel room, and she'd been raped. And she came in to see me, and as she sat down, I said, "Can I help you?" And she screamed, "I wish my mother was with me." But the way she said it, it reverberates in my soul even now. I wish my mother was with me, you know. And then suddenly her mother was like whoosh, almost like a cartoon character. Her mother's energy was right next to me, very powerful. And the mother said, "I died of breast cancer and I was 64. Right. So then I said to this lady, "Oh, I think your mother is with you. She died of breast cancer." I didn't mean to say that because I think I was overshadowed because in a busy clinic, the last thing I wanted to do, because I'd have my nurses saying, "Come on, none of this nonsense, get on with it," you know. And luckily, it was the last patient of the morning. And so I said to her, "I'm sure she is with you. She died of breast cancer." And then the patient said, "Oh, how do you know?" Because she was in a state of stress. And I pretended, I said, "Oh, it's just a lucky guess, you see." Because I was trying to BS my way out of the situation I put myself in, because I think this mother had just overshadowed me. Anyway, got the patient on the couch, and my nurse came in. Oh, Pamela, she was lovely. She passed away not so long ago. Lovely woman. But anyway, she was a bit psychic as well. And this lady said to Pam, "Is Dr. Blackwell psychic?" Because she said, because she won't give me a straight answer, you know. And Pam sort of was sidekicking away. And Pam said, "Oh, what happened?" And she told her what happened. And Pam said, "Oh, how old was your mother when she died?" And she said she was 65. And I said, "No, she was 64. Well, you can imagine I had a patient with her vulva about a foot away from me, or maybe 18 inches, about to pass the speculum, legs akimbo, hers, not mine. And Pam, we're both Tauruses. She knew that, and so the patient said, Pam said, "Oh, she thought she was 65," and I said, "No, she was 64." And then the patient said, "Oh, she was my mother. I should know how old she was." Now her mother was overshadowing me again. I said, I don't care who she is. When she was 65, when she died. And so Pam said, "Oh, come on, girls, don't argue," because it was a ridiculous situation. And so Pam said, and Pam knew I wasn't going to give in until the patient agreed of mother's age. So Pam said, "Oh, what was your mother date of birth? When did she die?" Da, da, da. I was right. The patient was wrong. So clearly I hadn't been reading her mind. And so the patient went quiet. I did the exam. When she stood up, she just hugged me. And I said, "I think I better come clean. I'm in the middle of training as a spiritual healer. And I think your mother actually is here." And then I said, "Would you like me to give you some energy healing?" So the clinic was over. So I took her to my office and I just laid hands on her shoulders and just did a quiet internal prayer. I couldn't stay long because I had other things to do. And then after we'd finished, she said, "Have you got any kids? Have you got any kids?" I said, "No." She said, "You have now." And she hugged me. And
Wow.
I can feel that hug. And as she left, she said something beautiful to Pam. She said that she'd come in surrounded by darkness and had gone out surrounded by light. And that's when the doctor becomes a shaman. It wasn't a case of treat and earth rush. It isn't. The physical things are minor, but except the really horrible things, obviously. But it's the spiritual things get into her soul and connect in her. So yes, in answer to your question, I think our late people who love us, it always comes for me on the vibe of love, luckily. And so if they love, it takes a lot of energy, I think, for them to come down to our vibration. But that's cool, I think.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that, which leads me to the last question. If there's one thing modern medicine can learn from the mystic path, what would it be?
Oh, gosh. Inevitably, with patient numbers increasing, there's going to be increase in use of technology, which isn't necessarily bad. But human contact is so important. Looking a patient in the eyes and if necessary, holding their hand, because I think that there is so much of fear of litigation that people no longer appreciate that just holding someone's hands can be extremely therapeutic. Just the presence of the doctor as a healer. So don't forget your humanity. Don't forget humanity.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, because a lot of times when I go to the doctor, I see a robotic situation going on. Like it seems like that McDonald's where they the robotic filling up your sodas and stuff. It's just so robotic. I don't feel like they're looking into your eyes anymore. Many doctors and being fully present with the human connection. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. I used to do a little test with my students, because I used to lecture to them for a couple of hours on genitourinary medicine. And I used to say, I got half an hour now and I can tell you the important stuff. And so they would stay behind, almost all of them. And one exercise I used to do would be, I'd ask for a volunteer, and I was trying to explain to them the importance of eye-to-eye contact. And so I just said, well, sit there now. And I said, for 1 minute, tell me why you decided you wanted to be a doctor. And during that minute, I would engage and nod and agree and grunt. And then for 1 minute, they'd carry on. And I would tap my watch, look at my watch, yawn, look away. And I remember this one woman, after about 20 seconds of me ignoring her, said, "I'm awfully sorry, Dr. Blackwell, I want to kill you." Because she couldn't stand the lack of eye contact. And I said, well, you feel like that. Imagine how your patients feel like if you're just staring at the screen. I'm not blaming doctors. They don't have the time, And I find the doctors I see, they are, really lovely in the general practice I go to. But I know that they're under such time constraints. So, yeah, it's very sad.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. I'm going to end it with a perfect quote for this conversation. And it's by Dan Millman. And he says, consciousness is not in the body. The body is in consciousness, and you are that consciousness.
Yeah.
Anona, thanks for coming on.
No, my pleasure. Namaste. God bless you. And you can go deep sea diving now. You have to get snorkeling. to go with your headphones.
Have you ever heard the term wordmaster?
Oh, you're a webmaster, are you? Like a big spider?
No, weirdmaster, like weird.
Oh, right. I don't know that. No.
The
No,
weirdness
sorry.
in me honors the weirdness in you.
Oh,
Thanks for coming on.
I told you my hearing was bad. I read it as webmaster. That's my left brain interfering.
Well, thank you.
Take
Namastizzle.
care. I'm the same to
Bye-bye.
you. God bless you. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye.
Just know we out here. Know we out here working in a major way. Had to speak on it just to make a play. Any given subject, know we make a way. Time to level up on a day-to-day. Know we out here working for the greater good. Expand your mind, broaden your lens the way you should. From the stars to the galaxy to speak on spirituality. Higher understanding for the neighborhood.